Somewhere on a beach in the Philippines, in the last weeks of 1945, sailors doused the finest small warships in the American arsenal with gasoline and set them on fire. Not sunk in battle, not lost to a storm. Burned on purpose, by their own crews, on direct orders from the United States Navy. These were the boats that had carried a young lieutenant named John F. Kennedy through the darkest nights of the Pacific War. The boats that had run torpedoes into the black water of the Solomon Islands while destroyers hunted them with searchlights. And within months of victory, the Navy didn't want them anymore. You've probably heard the story that 10,000 of these boats were sold off to civilians after the war for a few $1,000s each, a fire sale of surplus speedboats flooding docks from Florida to California. That story sounds incredible. It is also almost entirely false. There were never 10,000 PT boats. There were never even 1,000. And what actually happened to them is stranger and far more brutal than any invented number could ever be. To understand why the ending was so violent, you have to understand how rare these boats really were. The United States Navy built somewhere between 530 and 690 PT boats across the entire war, depending on how you count prototypes, and the handful finished after VJ Day. That's it. Compare that to the thousands of Liberty ships, the tens of thousands of Sherman tanks, the hundreds of thousands of trucks that rolled off American assembly lines during the war. PT boats were a boutique weapon, built almost entirely from plywood and Packard aircraft engines, designed for a mission nobody in the Navy had taken seriously before Pearl Harbor. 2 companies built almost all of them. The Electric Boat Company, known as Elco, based in Bayonne, New Jersey, produced the 80-foot design that became the most common PT boat in American service. Higgins Industries, the same New Orleans firm famous for the landing craft that hit the beaches at Normandy and Iwo Jima, built a slightly shorter 78-foot version. A third company, Huckins Yacht Corporation, built barely a few dozen more, mostly used for training rather than combat. At the height of Elco's wartime production, more than 3,000 workers operated the plant in 3 shifts a day, 6 days a week, turning out a finished PT boat roughly every 60 hours. That output, astonishing for the time, still only added up to a few hundred boats across 4 years of war. The design itself only existed because of a strange, almost accidental scramble that started years before Pearl Harbor. As early as 1938, with war already looming over Europe, the Navy put out a call for proposals for a fast, small, torpedo-armed boat, something the United States hadn't seriously invested in since a handful of experiments after the First World War. More than 30 different designs were submitted by naval architects and boat builders across the country. Elco, eager to get ahead of the competition, didn't even start from an American blueprint. The company bought an existing motor torpedo boat design directly from a British firm, shipped the prototype across the Atlantic, and used it as the foundation for what would eventually become the standard 80-foot Elco hull. Higgins and Huckins developed their own designs in parallel, and in the tense months before America entered the war, the Navy staged a series of competitive trials that boat builders and sailors nicknamed the Plywood Derby, pitting prototype against prototype in rough water to see which design could survive the pounding of open ocean combat. Elco's boats won speed trials but suffered structural problems in early tests. Higgins refined a slightly shorter, sturdier hull. In the end, the Navy didn't pick just one winner. It picked 2 and ordered both companies to start mass production the moment America was pulled into the war. These weren't just small boats. They were fast, dangerous, and disposable in the eyes of the Navy's own admirals, even while they were winning headlines back home. A PT boat could hit speeds over 40 knots, skimming across the water on a hull barely 80 feet long, armed with torpedo tubes, machine guns, and eventually a small cannon bolted onto the deck. They fought in nearly every theater where the United States sent ships. In the Mediterranean, they harassed German and Italian shipping along the coasts of Sicily and Italy. In the English Channel, they supported the invasion of Normandy. But it was in the Pacific where PT boats built their legend, prowling the narrow straits of the Solomon Islands, hunting Japanese barges, resupplying isolated garrisons, and occasionally trading fire with far larger warships that could have destroyed them in a single broadside. It was there, off the island of Guadalcanal, that PT boats scored their most famous kill, sinking the Japanese destroyer Teruzuki. And it was there, in August of 1943, that a young naval officer named John F. Kennedy watched his own boat, PT-109, get sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer in the middle of the night. The wreck stayed afloat for hours before it finally went under. Kennedy survived and swam his surviving crew to safety across miles of open water. That single incident, more than any other, is why so many Americans even remember these boats exist. But for every PT-109, there were hundreds of ordinary patrols, night missions in the dark, mechanical failures, friendly fire accidents, and quiet losses that never made the newspapers. Of the several hundred boats built during the war, close to 100 were lost before Japan ever surrendered. Some were sunk by enemy shore guns or enemy destroyers. Some struck mines. A handful were destroyed by kamikaze aircraft in the final desperate months of the Pacific Campaign. A number were even lost to friendly fire, mistaken in the dark and confusion of night combat for enemy vessels by American aircraft and warships who had only seconds to decide whether to shoot. And some crews, rather than let their boats fall into enemy hands during a retreat, scuttled their own vessels rather than risk capture. The wooden hulls that made PT boats fast and cheap to build also made them exceptionally vulnerable. A direct hit from even a modest caliber shell could turn a boat's fuel tanks into a fireball in seconds, and crews knew it every time they went out on patrol. It was, by any measure, one of the more dangerous jobs a young American sailor could volunteer for in the entire war. By the summer of 1945, none of that mattered anymore. Germany had surrendered in May. Japan surrendered in August, and the largest industrial mobilization in American history began grinding to a halt almost overnight. Factories that had built bombers, tanks, rifles, and boats around the clock suddenly had no orders to fill. Millions of servicemen wanted to go home immediately, and the government wanted to send them. But that left the Navy holding an enormous, scattered fleet of vessels, many of them stationed thousands of miles from the nearest American port, in places without the infrastructure to maintain them, sell them, or even store them properly. And PT boats, more than almost any other class of vessel, presented a special kind of problem. They were built almost entirely from wood, which meant they demanded constant, expensive maintenance just to keep from rotting in tropical humidity. Their triple-Packard engines were thirsty for high-octane aviation-grade fuel, the kind of expensive gasoline nobody wanted to keep shipping to remote Pacific bases now that the war was over. A peacetime Navy, shrinking its budget and its footprint overnight, had no use for hundreds of fast, fragile, fuel-hungry attack boats sitting in tropical harbors with no enemy left to fight. So the decision came down from the Navy's own bureaucracy, not through some single dramatic order, but through the ordinary grinding logic of post-war demobilization. Surplus property boards across the military were tasked with deciding, ship by ship, tank by tank, truck by truck, what could be sold, what could be scrapped, and what simply wasn't worth the paperwork. For most large, steel-hulled ships, the answer was often storage, sale to Allied navies, or eventual scrapping for their metal. But PT boats didn't fit neatly into any of those categories. Their wooden hulls had little scrap value. Their specialized high-performance engines and fittings made them impractical for most civilian buyers looking for an ordinary pleasure boat. And shipping hundreds of them back across the Pacific to the United States just to store them in a mothball fleet nobody expected to use again made no financial sense to a Navy trying to cut costs as fast as possible. In the calculus of post-war disposal boards working through mountains of surplus equipment, from tanks and trucks to entire fleets of aircraft, PT boats were quietly classified among the assets not worth preserving. It wasn't a decision made with any particular ceremony. Somewhere in a stack of paperwork, alongside decisions about bulldozers, jeeps, and spare aircraft engines, a line item for PT boats came through, and the recommendation was disposal rather than retention. No admiral held a press conference to announce it. No official history singled it out as a significant moment. It was simply one more entry in the largest demobilization the world had ever seen, a bureaucratic footnote that happened to erase, almost entirely, one of the more storied classes of vessel in the American fleet. The order that followed was as simple as it was ruthless. Strip them of anything useful, then destroy what remained. What happened next took place mostly out of the public eye, far from American shores, in the humid air of the Philippine archipelago. At a facility the Navy called PT Base 17, near Bourbon Point on the island of Samar, sailors carried out the disposal of well over 100 boats. Crews stripped the hulls of engines, radios, weapons, anything with resale or salvage value. Then the empty wooden shells were dragged up onto the beach, doused in fuel, and set alight. More than 120 PT boats were destroyed at that single location alone. Boats that had carried torpedoes into combat, now reduced to smoke and ash on a beach they'd never fought near. Elsewhere, similar scenes played out at other Pacific bases. Boats burned, sunk, or simply abandoned where they sat because moving them wasn't worth the cost. It was, in the most literal sense, the Navy setting its own history on fire, not out of malice, but out of pure post-war economics. Wood rots. Fuel is expensive. Peacetime budgets don't care about legends. Not every PT boat met that fate, though, and the ones that escaped the beach fires tell some of the strangest stories of the entire post-war surplus era. A small number of boats, spared the torch either through Navy retention, private purchase, or simple bureaucratic accident, ended up scattered into wildly different second lives. Take PT-617, an Elco boat that somehow avoided destruction and instead passed into private hands after the war. Its new owner didn't use it as some kind of historical relic. He turned it into a working boat, first as a private yacht, then later as a salvage vessel, and eventually as a diving platform off the coast of Florida. Over those years, it carried names that would have made its wartime crew laugh out loud, cycling through civilian identities like Big Red Cock and Dragon Lady, a far cry from the serious military designation it once carried into combat. It wasn't until 1979 that a non-profit organization made up of PT boat veterans finally purchased the boat and began the long process of restoring it to its wartime configuration. Today it sits on permanent display at Battleship Cove in Massachusetts, one of the very few PT boats anyone can walk up and see in person. Then there's PT-658, a Higgins-built boat completed in New Orleans so late in the war that it never even saw combat, originally slated to join a squadron in the Pacific just as the fighting ended. Rather than being burned, it was eventually sold in 1958 to a private individual in California, near Oakland and Alameda, and renamed Porpoise, spending decades as an anonymous civilian boat on the water with no obvious sign of its wartime pedigree. It took until the 1990s for a preservation group to track it down, buy it back, and spend the better part of a decade restoring it to running order. It's now one of only 2 PT boats in the world that are fully restored and still capable of getting underway under their own power, based today in Portland, Oregon. Another survivor, PT-305, a Mediterranean combat veteran nicknamed Sudden Jerk by its own crew after an embarrassing docking accident, was eventually rescued and rebuilt by the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, not far from the very shipyard where its keel was first laid down in 1943. A sister boat, PT-309, also a Mediterranean veteran, ended up fully restored at a military museum in Texas. Handfuls of others went to Hollywood, quietly repurposed or imitated for films that wanted the look of a PT boat without the expense of maintaining a genuine wartime hull. For the movie about Kennedy's own PT-109, the production crew didn't even use a real surviving PT boat, but modified Air Force crash rescue boats to look the part, because so few originals were left by the time the film went into production. Out of the several hundred PT boats that the United States Navy built across the entire war, only a dozen are confirmed to survive today, along with a couple of experimental hulls in various states of decay. A dozen, not 10,000, not even 100. 12 boats out of hundreds, scattered between museums, private collections, and a handful of non-profit restoration groups who spent decades tracking down hulls that had been sold, renamed, repurposed, and nearly forgotten. Most of what the American public imagines when they picture surplus PT boats after the war, some folk memory of a nationwide fire sale flooding civilian marinas with cut-rate Navy speedboats, simply never happened at that scale. What actually happened was smaller, stranger, and in some ways, more haunting. A tiny number of individually famous combat boats, quietly burned in the hundreds on a beach in the Philippines because a wooden hull wasn't worth the fuel bill in peacetime, while a handful of the lucky few slipped through the disposal system entirely by accident, living out bizarre second lives as yachts, salvage boats, dive platforms, and eventually museum pieces bearing almost no resemblance to the war machines they once were. The legacy of that decision still shapes what we know and don't know about PT boats today. Because so few survived, and because so many of the surviving records from Pacific disposal operations were incomplete or simply not kept in detail, historians and collectors have spent decades since piecing together exactly which boats burned, which were sold, and which quietly vanished into civilian obscurity with their wartime service completely erased from memory. The boats that do survive have become genuinely priceless, not in raw dollar value, but in historical weight, because there is simply no replacing them. You cannot build a new PT-305 and have it mean the same thing. Every rivet, every plank, every scar in the wood on the survivors carries decades of history that the destroyed majority took with them into the fire on that beach in Samar. Modern high-speed patrol craft, literal combat ships, and even some special operations boats used by today's Navy trace a design lineage back to the lessons learned from PT boats, their engines, their hull shapes, their vulnerabilities, and their strengths all studied and absorbed into decades of naval engineering that followed. Veterans organizations spent years, sometimes decades, tracking hulls through property records, boatyards, and private owners who often had no idea what they actually owned until someone knocked on their door asking questions about a strange old wooden boat with 3 engine mounts and torpedo tube scars nobody could quite explain. Some of those owners had used their boats for fishing trips. Some had rented them out. At least one had been converted into little more than a houseboat before historians tracked it down. The line between forgotten junk and irreplaceable artifact, in the case of these boats, was often nothing more than which private buyer happened to hang on to their purchase a little longer than everyone else. The story of the PT boat, in the end, isn't a story about 10,000 cheap surplus speedboats handed out to eager civilians. It's a story about how quickly a nation can decide that yesterday's legendary weapon is today's expensive liability, and how a few accidents of fate are often the only reason anything survives at all. If a single sailor at Base 17 had made a different call about a single boat, or if one private buyer somewhere hadn't happened to want a cheap, fast hull for fishing or salvage work, we might have even fewer than 12 boats left to remind us this story ever happened. So the next time you see a viral claim about thousands of surplus warships handed out for a few $1,000s each, remember what actually happened to the PT boats. Remember Bourbon Point and the smoke rising off a beach that nobody photographed for the history books. Remember Big Red Cock and Dragon Lady and the strange, almost comic afterlives some of these war machines lived out under names nobody in the Navy would have chosen. If this kind of hidden post-war history is exactly the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because there are dozens more stories like this one waiting. Stories about the equipment that won the war and then simply vanished, sold, buried, sunk, or burned, while the world moved on to the next headline. Somewhere out there is another beach, another warehouse, another forgotten disposal order just waiting to be uncovered, and next time, we're going to find it.